This is one of the reasons why economists are so up in arms about this, because Trump is saying, no, we don't play this role anymore. And that basically means this entire sort of consensus that we had is kind of now in doubt. There is a gun on the table type aspect to the tariffs, that he will use them to get a better deal for the United States. Does he need to get the Mexican jobs back to the United States? Absolutely not. This would be a trade war, and the surplus country cannot win it, so China cannot win it. I think the best thing for China would be just to take it on the chin and just move on.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. So it's week 3 of the new presidency over in the US. And the T word is on everyone's lips. And I'm not talking about Trump on this occasion, although that's certainly true. I'm talking about tariffs. This word that has been sort of bandied about in a theoretical context while he was campaigning. And people have been speculating, would he do it? Will he do it? Is it real? Is it just a threat? And then bang, this week, we had 25% tariffs announced overnight against both Canada and Mexico and 10% on China. There's talk of more tariffs coming our way here in the UK, potentially to the European Union as well. I think it's time for us all to brush up on tariffs and what they actually mean, what the history is, and what might now happen in the world if they become a big feature of geopolitics. Happily, we have here in-house our very own star columnist Wolfgang Münchau, who, as well as being an expert on Europe and Germany and all sorts of other things, is a bit of an expert on the T word. Welcome, Wolfgang.
Thank you, Freddie.
I want to start with a bit of a kind of background history lesson, because tariffs, which is the imposition of import duties on goods and services coming in from other countries, used to be the dominant way that governments raised income, right? If you think of Henry VIII or Tudor kings, or even right up to the 19th century, tariffs were commonplace.
Absolutely. It was the main source. One forgets that these days income tax was introduced as a temporary tax. And obviously this is still, in virtually every country, it persists, and it has become the modern way to raise taxes, and obviously VAT and other things. Tariffs used to be the main source of income for governments, and it came out of the mindset of the mercantilist age.
What does mercantilism mean?
Mercantilism is a trade policy that enriches governments through tariffs and through achieving surpluses, export surpluses.
Got to ask again, what is an export surplus?
An export surplus is meaning exporting more than you're importing.
Okay.
In those days, the money was gold, or the people had money, but the money had a fixed exchange rate with gold. So essentially, gold was the money. So what would happen if you had an export surplus, i.e., if you exported more than imported, you would amass gold.
It's kind of intuitive, isn't it? It's the free trade argument that is harder to get your head around.
Much harder.
Most people intuitively would say, okay, that makes sense. You want to sell more than you're buying, and then you get a sort of profit.
Absolutely, and I think this attitude is still very much alive. I've just written this book about Germany, in a country where that attitude still is very strong. We have to sell more than we buy, and we get rich. Now, it's no longer about gold. It's no longer about the government. This is about corporations. This is sort of a slightly different version of mercantilism, but essentially the same mindset that's behind it. And Trump follows that line, except that he starts from a very bad position, because the United States is a country that has a trade deficit. It imports a lot more than it exports. He doesn't want to turn this around. He wants to balance this. This is his idea, and he wants to do it with each country. So he doesn't look at just the United States as a whole versus the rest of the world. He looks at the US-Canada trade balance, or the US-Mexico trade balance. US-China trade balance is really very negative for the United States.
The idea of free trade, as opposed to mercantilism or a kind of tariff-based approach, it has roots in Adam Smith and Ricardo and 18th and 19th century philosophers, but it never really became normal policy until the 20th century, did it?
Absolutely, and you could say on a global level until the late 20th century. The philosopher of free global trade is Ricardo, with its comparative advantage. And in comparative advantage, and this is, I think, the theory that's behind free trade that, as you said, people have difficulty still today to wrap their head around. It's not just about us making what we are good at and you making what you're good at. It is about sometimes us not making things that we are good at and letting you do it, because it allows us to focus on the things that we are really good at. So if we are really good at AI and still better than you at steel, we leave the steel to you and have our resources focusing on AI, just taking an economy in which people only produce steel and artificial intelligence. Obviously, you can expand this to other sectors, but this is ultimately the idea of comparative advantage. It's not absolute advantage, but comparative. And that's the idea we specialize, the world specialized, like the Germans were good at making cars, so they specialized on making cars, and other people made components for the cars, the seats. And Germans could probably also produce seats and probably do this really well, but they let Poland or Slovakia produce the seats, and that's the idea that kind of caught on a global level. That's ultimately what the globalization of goods was about. There is another side to it, which is the globalization of finance, but the globalization of goods was about playing the Ricardo idea of comparative advantage.
And that reached an apogee, you could say, in the 1990s or early 2000s, didn't it?
Yes.
I mean, with the era of Clinton and Blair was very much based on this kind of free trade, globalized world idea. Some people still think of that as the golden age, the world as it should ideally be. And other people will say that that was the big mistake. That was the era which laid the foundations for this populist backlash. And people like Donald Trump and all of the populists around the world look back on the 1990s as an era of huge naivety. How should we understand those two opposing arguments?
I think they're both true, but sometimes it's difficult to wrap your head around the fact that two conflicting things can be true. It was a golden age, no question about this, in terms of the wealth it created. If you look at what China achieved, coming from a feudal society in economic terms, pretty much from the 1990s, to a modern industrial era that has overtaken the EU on so many levels in a very short period of time, that would not have been possible without the age of globalization, without the investments that took place in China.
And without China being welcomed into the World Trade Organization.
Indeed.
And having tariffs removed, the T word against it.
Yes,
they were
absolutely.
actually turned into free traders, and it was net good for China, at least economically.
The heyday of globalization really was the era from the collapse of communism in the late 1980s, early 1990s, until the global financial crisis. If you look at the amount of sort of trade in, as a percentage of global GDP, it kind of peaked at around 2007, 2008. It stayed sort of broadly the same level. It fluctuated a bit, but with no big tendency. We don't actually see deglobalization happening yet. What we're seeing is tariffs. We're seeing less investment. So we are seeing stuff happening, but it's not like we are reversing at the moment. We're sort of at a call it, I wouldn't call it an inflection point. It could actually be, it could actually be sort of a long peak, and then it could come down. And I would expect it to come down as these policies start to bite and start to be implemented.
Well, because the politics is part of that, isn't it?
Yes.
Since the global financial crash, more and more national governments have been populist, at least particularly since 2016, obviously. And a lot of that energy is about trying to kind of return to nationalism. It's all about not giving your jobs away to far-flung places like China, trying to restore an industrial base. A lot of our politics at the moment can be explained as a reaction to the free trade high point of the 1990s. Yeah.
I think there was a step in between. If you take sort of the global financial crisis, the starting point for where it sort of started to go downhill, the first thing we did was QE and austerity. And that changed, wealth balances.
Quantitative easing.
Quantitative
printing
easing,
money.
printing money. It made a lot of people rich people richer. It was one of the biggest driver of inequality. At the same time, governments imposed austerity. Nowhere more so than in the EU, because the EU had its own sovereign debt crisis during that period, and they responded to this with austerity. And that was also one of the reasons the EU ended up running these large trade surpluses against America, because that's how the EU recovered, by consuming less goods made from others and trying to sell more to others at a vastly improved exchange rate, because the euro devalued in that period.
At its heart, the populist argument is that this idea of universal free trade and a globalized economy pushed by pointy-headed, clever economists writing columns for places like the Financial Times, where you used to write a column, all sounds very good on paper, and it's very theoretical and it sounds very clever, but it ultimately led to jobs for lower income factory workers being removed. The idea was it was supposed to be creative destruction and they'd all retrain as software developers or something, but it didn't happen as much as it was supposed to. And it also, secondarily, ignored geopolitics. So that it's nice to have a single global market where everyone makes different things around the world, but as soon as there's a tension or a war like we have with Russia or tension with China, suddenly you're like, well, I need to make the seats for the cars because I can't import them anymore. I need to have energy onshore because I can't import it. So it feels like those two arguments are central to the populist wave. Deal with them for us. Are they wrong? Are they right?
I mean, it's the classic thing of something that works in theory but not in practice. In theory, yes, the system was premised on the idea of Trump not getting elected, just put it as crudely as that, and Putin not invading Ukraine, and us not needing to increase our defense spending, and climate change not happening. So in other words, it was premised on assumptions that were simply completely unrealistic. And they were not robust, not resilient to shocks. And we had a fair share of shocks, pandemic, war. When I started as a journalist sort of in the 1980s, 1990s, we were in awe of macroeconomics because macroeconomics explained the world of globalization really well. But ever since the global financial crisis, I've noticed that macroeconomics, especially the trade people, but also monetary economics, progressively failed to explain what's going on, like the inflation shock, like what happened with globalization. I mean, people predicted that Brexit would lead to disaster. And whatever views you hold about it, it didn't lead to disaster economically. It may not have achieved what you wanted to achieve, but it certainly didn't change. The first Trump term was predicted to lead to disaster, and it didn't. So these theoretical models that still, that have a certain theoretical beauty. I actually know these models and I know how they work technically. And there is a certain pleasing aesthetic to them, but they don't work anymore.
And do you accept then, I think of you as a free trader still, is that
I am,
is
absolutely.
That right? Do you feel like the Wolfgang of the 2000s was overly enthusiastic about free trade? Were you also idealistic or naive? Is there a kind of mea culpa in all of this?
Oh, absolutely. I think everyone who wrote and who engaged in economic debate at the time, and I did, as you mentioned, I was writing columns back then about the global economy, about the European economy. We were all free traders, all big fans of the single market, because we have to say in Europe the single market at that time was a liberalizing project. It was, we came from restrictive national markets to a liberal European markets. The EU has moved in another direction. The US is now moving in another direction, so we are in a very different world.
I notice, I don't know if you agree with this, that free trade voices are a lot quieter these days. You would expect, even on this week of all weeks, where the President of the United States has launched these extraordinary tariffs against his allies as well as his kind of rivals, very few people are just banging the traditional free trade drum. Everyone is conceding that he kind of has a point. Do you observe that?
Yeah, absolutely. There are still, in the community of international macroeconomists, they are not conceding any points. For them, it's just free trade is good, and in some ideal world it would be. But what has been happening with free trade is that countries amassed, like the mercantilist of the old eras. If you have people in this system, like China and Germany, and the Netherlands to a smaller extent, if you have countries like that actually play the game so that they achieve large persistent surpluses. It's not that they're large, it's that they're persistent. That's the more important thing. That makes it unsustainable. And that's why the United States is in this position that it runs this huge trade deficit against the rest of the world. But behind this lies some other deeper imbalances that is actually much more troubling. Mm-hmm. And that is an imbalance that built up pretty much since the global financial crisis. It started before, but since the global financial crisis, it's very, very evident. Of the US becoming the absorber of the world's savings surpluses. Now, this is perhaps the most complicated thing I'm going to say today, but
okay,
I think it is important. When countries run export surpluses, and we discuss what they are, just exporting more than importing, there is, like a shop or a company having double entry bookkeeping. We have to, there are always two entries to everything we do. The other side of the coin is that we're actually saving more than we're investing. And it's actually the same thing. It's not just approximately, it's not some relationship or correlation. They are actually the same thing. So when Germany exports more to the United States than the other way around, then Germany saves more than it invests, and the United States invests more than it saves.
Will you just explain that in a bit more detail?
Saving is what the nation saves. It's not what you and I save. People always save. That's not the problem. It's not that individuals, have too big savings accounts, but it is the government. The government having a surplus or a deficit. If a government having a deficit, it sort of does the opposite of saving. And if it uses the deficit to invest into infrastructure, then it invests. And this is the balance. And the private sector, the same. The German private sector, for example, it makes a lot of profits, but it cannot invest those profits at home. So it invests those profits abroad. And that's what the United States does. It sucks in the savings from other countries. And that's why the US stock market is performing so well. And that's why the US dollar is the great, the leading currency of the world.
So there's a kind of flip side to this. Just
Exactly.
as the United States has all of these trade deficits and it sells less than it buys, the positive side of that is that it means all these countries that it's trading with end up investing some of their surpluses back in US currency and US stocks.
Yeah. And that was the ultimate dynamics of the world of globalization. That's how it worked. That the America acted as an anchor. It was the absorber of excess savings. And the trade deficit wasn't just something that happened. It was the essential feature of the system of globalization. And this is one of the reasons why economists are so up in arms about this, because Trump is saying, no, we don't play this role anymore. And that basically means this entire sort of consensus that we had is kind of now in doubt, because if America no longer absorbs the big saving surpluses from the rest of the world, who else will do this? There isn't anybody. And it basically means that the models that China runs, now China might still adjust and dump its stuff to the EU, but someone will end up with holding the baby basically. And that means that all these business models that people in the world kind of erected for themselves are no longer viable. Germany's business model of being an industrial economy that produces surpluses, export surpluses to the rest of the world, that is no longer viable, because Germany will not be able to export more than it imports if you need a trading partner. If you add up all the exports and imports of the world and you did it properly, you would get zero. Logically, because we don't trade with Mars, so everything has to cancel out. So if the importer stops importing or puts a tariff on the imports, which means makes them more expensive, there's less demand, and so there will be less of it. That will mean that the model that Germany runs will become less viable. Now, China runs a very similar model.
It's all about exports.
All about exports. It suppresses domestic consumption because China isn't a free market itself. China, the government plays a very big role in the banking system. So it frustrates a lot of consumption through the way the economy works.
The key political question is this readjustment that you're talking about, which could be very dramatic, a good thing or a bad thing? Because Donald Trump obviously shares your observation about long-term deficits, and he doesn't like them, and he wants to correct it. He obviously believes that the trade balance of the world needs to fundamentally change and thinks that this new settlement will be better for the United States. Is he right?
No, he doesn't actually identify the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that America is kind of living beyond its means. This is what it means when you import more than you export. And he's certainly not fixing that. And he's also, and this is I think where the big mistake is, he focuses on bilateral trade balances. And it doesn't quite work like that. If he fixes the US-Canada trade balance is not a big issue. I mean, in merchandise goods, Canada has a surplus. In services, the US has a surplus. They kind of cancel each other out. With the EU, it doesn't cancel out. America buys a lot more goods from the EU than the EU buys from America. If you go to New York and you see in a restaurant, European wines, European cheese, European products are everywhere in the United States. That's not the case in Europe. If the purpose of tariffs is simply to collect money, then it would not work, because what would happen is the dollar would rise and it would completely do the opposite of what you would want to get.
Why? It can raise a huge amount of money very quickly.
He would raise money. Well, that would be, what would happen if you impose, say, 20% tariffs on trade from the EU? Every European product would become 20% more expensive. Demand would fall. But for those, prices would rise and demand would fall. Classic rebalancing.
But money would be raised, right?
Money would be raised, indeed. The US balance, budget deficit would fall. Most of the economists, financial economists I know, think the dollar would go up. It's a complicated question. But if the dollar goes up, that means it makes foreign goods even more competitive and would completely compensate for the tariff effect. So demand would stay strong. The prices would go up, but the products would become cheaper. So the overall effect might be neutralized by that.
I've got to push back a bit because the orthodox economic answer to this is that it's going to fail because, as you say, prices will rise, it will become politically unpopular eventually at home, and it won't work economically. There are some voices that are, I guess, in the minority who say that it could work both politically and economically for the US because he will raise lots of money quickly through tariffs. He can use that money to reduce taxes internally at home, reduce income tax, and head back towards a more kind of 19th century style economy, which would be popular among his people because nobody likes paying income tax.
So let's play through this argument. He uses the tariffs to raise money. Then he would probably keep the tariff against Mexico in place. So the whole fentanyl thing is just a front. He just wants the money. The main thing for starters wouldn't be to cut income tax. The main thing first would be to save even more money on the government side and spending, because the US is running a very, very large deficit.
Which is also part of his plan with Elon Musk's
Absolutely.
Doge, etc.
So if he does the government, if he saves money on federal spending, if he collects money through his newly created External Revenue Service, and he cuts income taxes, he could create a more an economy that is greater in balance and that is, in a sense, more frugal. But there's nothing fundamentally wrong about trade. And I think Trump also instinctively understands this, that he needs to trade. He's a free trader too. He's just
put 25% tariffs on his two
but he
neighboring
wants American goods to have. I mean, what America did historically under the beginning of the century, it outshored like nobody else did, and that went too far. That was unhealthy. The Germans didn't do this. The Germans didn't outshore. The British did outshore similarly to the Americans. And I think the Germans went to the other extreme by not, they still do, still have a strong steel industry. That may not have been such a smart idea, but the degree of outshoring that happened in the United States, so there is definitely a case for a pushback.
So do you think more industry inside the US is a potential result of a high tariffs policy? Could it be, for example, big machinery, trucks, there are big tariffs on, that's a big import. Will lots of American companies start buying American-made trucks? Tesla has just come out with one, we notice. It may be that's quite handy for Elon Musk, but what do you think?
To some extent, yes, but we also have to then getting into what modern industry is like and how it differs from old industry. If you go outside of New York into Connecticut, you see these wastelands of old industry. That will not be revived. The idea of getting industry back that you lost is for the birds. That's not going to happen anywhere.
It's politically popular. And if you're doing an opinion poll in Detroit, a lot of people would quite like the car industry back.
Absolutely. You can win elections. I'm not saying you can't win elections on this ticket, but I'm saying it's not going to happen. He's going to bring in industry, but it will be, industry 4.0. It will not be industry, 1.0 or 2.0, the ones that you lost.
Let's talk about this week. We had 3 big tariffs announced: China, Mexico, and Canada. Already today, the Mexican and the Canadian tariffs of 25% have been suspended for a month, pending a bigger deal that both leaders are talking about with President Trump. What's your take on that? Do you think we conclude from that President Trump was never serious about those tariffs? It was always just a bargaining tool because he wanted to sort out questions on the border and so on? Or do you think after a month, tariffs will be back?
It could be both. It could be that certainly there is a gun on the table type aspect to the tariffs, that he will use them to get a better deal for the United States. And that, I'm sure, will be the case when he comes to the EU. Mexico, his big issue is the border. And, he got a pretty good deal. He always said that Mexico should pay for the wall. That was his famous campaign theme in 2016. Now, it doesn't pay for the wall, but it pays for the border security now, which is a pretty good next thing for him to get. If Mexico can cut down on the fentanyl trade, which, most of the fentanyl trade comes from Mexico, doesn't come from Canada. So if most of the fentanyl comes from Mexico and Mexico stops people crossing the border and also stops fentanyl crossing the border, that's already a good deal. Does Trump necessarily...
win.
That's a win for him politically. Does he need to get the Mexican jobs back to the United States? Absolutely not. This kind of trading relationship is positive for American companies. And the other thing that I think might have happened this week, there was a very fierce market reaction to the tariffs announcement. And Trump is a market guy. And, market guys are not, people who are fundamentally principled. It's, if the market says this, and, Trump kind of respects the market's judgment. And so he may have thought, okay, we have to take a step back here and be cautious. So I think there is an element of that.
Because you could say he thinks like a deal maker, like a gambler almost. In a way, it's been a strong week for him because he came out with those surprisingly large tariffs, and he seems to have got a deal in exchange for suspending them. But the other side is that he didn't leave them on the table for very long. It was about 24 hours or 48 hours in Canada's case. It's not a long time, and it kind of communicates to the rest of the world that actually these tariffs are there as a bargaining chip.
Yeah, that's indeed a danger. And so if he takes them both back for virtually nothing in return, I don't think we will be in that scenario. I think he will, it's quite possible that he might take them back to Canada, to Mexico, and not to Canada. Because what's happening? I mean, that was the first, he got the border controls for suspending them. But this is only a 30-day suspension, and now the trade people are talking to each other. And the United States will go to Mexico and say, this is what we want. They have a list of grievances, and there will be some opening on the market, stuff that Mexico previously did not agree to. The Americans will try to push pretty much, North America, the United States will push its demands through. With Canada, it will be very difficult because it's hard to see what America can possibly want. It's a free market. It's not like Canada doesn't have any particularly unfair trade practices. There are some minor issues. I don't think these minor issues would have warranted a 25% tariff. So here with Canada, we will see whether Trump is serious about raising the money or just using it for other geopolitical purposes. I mean, there may be the dark motive that he might just weaken Canada in order to persuade Canada to
become the 51st
state.
It's also in context of the Chinese tariff, isn't it? Is there any sense, do you think, in which he said to himself, well, I'm going to put 25% on my friendly neighbours in order for it not to look like this is a kind of unilateral trade war against China. And 10% seemed less bad. But in fact, 10%, the Chinese tariffs is the one that he actually is serious about. Am I overthinking it?
No, this is exactly what it is. The 10% tariff on China, and the rumors are that there will be a 10% tariff on the EU. It looks like 10% seems to be the number. There are other scenarios. We also hear about phased-in tariffs. Never made a lot of sense to me, but that was also an alternative proposal, the idea that you phase them in order to, that was your alternative gun on the table type scenario. But, he's serious about China. The Chinese tariffs will now be approximately 25 to 30% because there were previously tariffs, so they come on top of the old ones. So the tariff protection against China and, if they come off against Mexico and Canada will be about 25%.
China, let's talk about now, is a different situation because obviously Trump has felt for a long time that trading relations with China are bad for the United States, and he wants to change that. What would a kind of tariff war with China do to the US? How does that play out to you?
Well, it would raise a lot of income. China has a trade surplus against the United States of about $300 billion, roughly around that size. And obviously, it's not only the surplus that would be taxed, the entirety of exports. I don't have the number in my head, but it's a very significant very significant amount of trade that that China has with the United States.
So raising money, good.
It could raise in the, close to 70, 80 billion, 90 billion a year. That's a lot of money even for the United States. And then obviously that would also apply to other trading partners. So it looks, we're looking at the combined deficit. So raising money will be the external revenue, that will be one factor. It's not the only factor, but that will be one factor.
But what happens when China then raises, as they already have, their retaliatory tariffs? What impact does that have?
If we think it's wrong for the US to do this, we have to actually ask the question, is it smart for China to do this? And the answer is, if you are the surplus country, as China is, a large surplus country, not just a tiny surplus, the surplus country has a lot more to lose than the deficit country, because if China raises tariffs on, the Europeans raised tariffs on Harley Davidson last time around. I mean, there are some totemic American products out there, but we're not buying a lot of American goods, so we can do this again and damage some companies there. But it would be easy for Trump then to get back and say, okay, if you do that, then we'll go from 10 to 20%. And China would be more damaged. The only reason...
So it's not wise for China to enter into a competitive tariff war.
Absolutely. This would be a trade war, and the surplus country cannot win it. So China cannot win it. China might be... I think the best thing for China would be just to take it on the chin and just move on.
The Chinese spokesman at the Washington, D.C. embassy said trade and tariff wars have no winners. So
that's right, Thomas.
It's just kind of an amusing, yet another strange aspect of today, that the free trade spokesman is coming out of the Chinese embassy. Indeed.
The Europeans say the same thing. It's true that trade wars have no winners. That is clear. Because this is, Ricardo is right. We're not. This is not wrong that we do competitive advantage. If we move the opposite way, we are today better off than we were 300 years ago. And one of the reasons we're all better off because of trade. So how do you think it plays out then, the China-American trading relationship, having started on this journey? Yeah, if the Chinese retaliate, as they may well do, the only reason to retaliate is to think you can win it. That's the only logical reason when you're the surplus country, because economically you're not benefiting from it, and that applies to Europe as well. For China, the only reason is they think they can make Trump blink first. What they can do, however, is they can restrict the export of sensitive goods to the United States, impose infinite tariff on their own goods. China pretty much controls the supply of a lot of the materials that go into electric car batteries. There is still a world dependency issue. China speaks for a lot of lithium production in the world. And it's worth just pointing out that Elon Musk is perhaps the character who's most conflicted on this, because absolutely. A trade war with China for the person who runs the biggest electric battery company, most of which is made in China and relies on Chinese parts, you've got to be thinking, what is going on inside Elon Musk's head? I would assume that that's right. He also does a lot of his AI testing in China, because China at the moment still has a more regulatory friendly regulatory environment. That would be a very difficult choice. And as we saw last week, with the launch of DeepSeek, Chinese are, shall we say, competitive. So actually, from what you're saying, it's possible that the 10% with China just sort of sits there and is part of the new normal, and China will take a more long-term strategic viewpoint about how to kind of further evolve their national business model and probably avoid a direct tariff war with the US. I would assume so. I think that the Chinese are smart enough not to go into a tariff war with anybody because it is not in their interest. They might go into a tariff war with the EU, but even when the EU imposed tariffs on Chinese cars, the Chinese were very loud and very angry, but they didn't do anything really horrible to us. So there is a restraint in China which goes with their position. It is not in China's interest to impose tariffs on the people you need to buy your products from. You basically want to appease them. I would probably I would do some really popular things in the United States. I would pay a lot of money to charity and help civil society or institutions and make yourself really popular in America to change the public perception of the country. That's the kind of thing that I would do rather than impose tariffs, which would make everything worse. What are the options for the EU and how should they react? I mean, the instinct is, and you saw Brussels already prepared a list. He prepared a list right after he was elected. So they would have, and I think they might have even prepared the list before he was elected, just in case he got elected. So there is a list of products in some drawer in Brussels, and it will come out immediately if and when these tariffs are imposed.
So you think they will do that?
I think the EU's instinct is to do this in the hope that they can cut a deal, very much in the same way as the Americans do, as Trump did with China, I'm putting this tariff on the table, but I might suspend it for a month and we'll have a conversation. The problem with the EU is that it runs a very large trade surplus, and Trump might not blink. Trump might not say, no, I'm not talking. If you're imposing a tariff on me, I'm doubling down. And let's see whether you double down. And if I buy more from you than you from me, that if we both keep on playing that game, I will win that game. And he will win that game with a probability of 100%. All he needs to do is not to blink. So this is a dangerous strategy for the EU unless they think he blinks, or unless they know he blinks.
Just on that, a world in which American consumers buy more Fords and fewer Volkswagens is exactly the world that Trump wants. Right,
Yeah,
so that's what he hopes.
If that happens, that may well be. I mean, the car industry is he hates the idea of German cars on American streets. So he may well find that this is what he wants. He had some bad experience. I mean, he got really, Europeans made promises to him in his first term, which they didn't deliver on. That was Angela Merkel's famously said to him, look, I'm gonna raise my defense spending to 2% of GDP. She never did this. There was Jean-Claude Juncker, the former European Commission president. He went to the White House and told Trump, well, I have this great idea. We're going to buy soybeans from you and stop making them at home. And Trump was initially very impressed by this, but in fact, turned out, obviously, Europeans don't produce soybeans at home. And we were already buying the soybeans from America. So it was not much of a promise that Juncker made. So
he feels a bit burned.
He feels burned. This is why I think the trade tariff against the EU will actually happen. Because Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, she delivered. She's the president, and she says, okay, I'll send 10,000 troops. You want this trading arrangement, ended? I'll do this. The EU can't do this because the EU would need to appease America. They would need to change the way the EU works. They may be able to cut the car tariff. They have their own car tariff. So at the moment, the EU imposes more tariffs on the US than the other way around. So the EU may do that. But that, for Trump, he's not going to sell more cars into the European market because what blocks the American car makers is not the tariff, it's the regulatory stuff. So he will say, I want all our products that exist in America, I want them to be accepted and freely distributable in the EU. And the EU would say no. The EU said no to Britain. That was the whole issue during the Brexit negotiations, that if you want to sell freely into the EU market, you have to be a member. And if you're not a member, you have to follow our standards.
And he's not wrong that there is a kind of anti-Americanism in Europe. There is a sense that European products are superior. America is a kind of regulation-free. We had this whole argument here about chlorine-washed chicken back in the Brexit days. There's the sense that somehow standards are better in Europe and we don't want American stuff.
Yeah,
so he's not wrong about that.
The EU has to understand that since that is the view they take, and the way the EU functions is very immobile. It can't just drop its regulation because of a threat. It doesn't work like that. It just takes 2 or 3 countries to say, no, we don't want this, and then it's not going to happen.
The big tension that may be coming down the road is not with Canada or Mexico so much, maybe not even necessarily with China if this new tariff just sits there. Europe could be the big battle to come.
Absolutely, because Europe cannot be the other party of a transactional deal. While the others can, President Xi and President Trump can just cut a deal. Never bet against the deal, but Ursula von der Leyen cannot do much other than changing tariffs, and that is not a big prize for Trump. So he's asking for a lot more than that. So and to balance the EU has a trade deficit, a trade surplus with the US of about 200 billion a year. It's rising dramatically, about 230 this year. So it's gone up by like
almost as big as China.
It's getting towards China. The EU as a whole, most of it is Germany. Germany, after all this trouble Germany was had this trade surplus with China, no longer does. Now Germany is the US is it used to be the UK was the largest source of the German trade surplus. With Brexit that stopped, then it became China, then it became the United States. And if that stops, obviously there isn't anyone else there who can absorb this.
But it's a very interesting idea that actually thinking in a more Trumpian way is almost infectious. And as these kind of standoffs take place, it actually encourages the other side of the bargain to think more like him. So we could see, it's one potential future, more and more European countries, and maybe eventually the majority of the EU, basically turning into a kind of mini Trump.
It could be. And in fact, some of this has happened. I observed this in the German discussion. I mean, Friedrich Merz, he said something which had very Trumpian sound. He said, the first day when I come into office, I will issue an executive order to control refugees at the border. Big story, and he can't quite so easily do this, but it's very unusual for a German chancellor to issue executive orders. They have in the constitution a mechanism called an executive order, hardly ever used. Usually something only used with consensus of everybody involved. And here was, they were obviously impressed by Trump, signing all these, hundreds of executive orders on day one of his second term. And also realizing that we couldn't do a thing like that. And now Merz is talking that language.
And this trade war or potential tariff war that may now happen might just accelerate that process.
Absolutely. And I think it will make Europe will suffer. I mean, it's true that the true thing with trade wars is it's sort of a banality to say that everyone loses. But it is actually true that some people lose more than others. You remember when when people had the war with Russia, the Ukraine war with Russia, there was this extreme confidence in the West that we can defeat Putin. But it turned out that Putin, has more stamina than we do, in terms of our ability our willingness to make sacrifices. We are not willing to sacrifice social policy for military, for weapons deliveries. We were not. In Germany, that turned us into a theme. Scholz was saying, I'm not willing to let pensioners pay for weapons deliveries in Ukraine. If I don't have the money, I can't do this. So I will only pay this through debt, but I'm not gonna, I'm not willing to sacrifice this. Now, on the other side is Putin, who has just shifted social spending into military spending. He's spending 6% of Russia's GDP on defense. Putin is not the first one to blink. We have actually blinked in this confrontation.
And what's the parallel to
The parallel
today?
is that if we had a trade war with Trump, we would blink first, not Trump.
Europe.
Yeah. The Europeans are constitutionally incapable of fighting a war. They're quite good at talking themselves into this, but they have not created the conditions for a sort of a Hobbesian type policy, because it requires leadership, it requires resources, willingness to shift resources, and willingness to stand up for what you believe in.
And you get the sense that Donald Trump knows that, and therefore might play harder ball with Europe than he is with some of his other allies.
Absolutely, and I think his advisors. If he has European advisors who know a little bit about Europe, he would say they will blink first if you stay tough, and that view would ultimately be right. I would also say to him, don't believe what they say to you. Just ask them to deliver first, and then make your decisions.
Okay, we are nearly out of time, and I want to do a couple of minutes on the country we are actually both in. The United Kingdom. It's last on our list, but even in the past 24 hours, it's been quite interesting, because you have Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who is in the middle of trying to renegotiate with the European Union and try to sort of have a better trading or relationship with the EU. But at the same time, even Keir Starmer was using slightly Trumpian language in his remarks to EU leaders, saying that he is not going to take sides on trade wars with the United States, that he wants to prioritize the, quote, vital interests of his own country. And it's quite clear that he's hoping that the UK gets a better deal than Europe and isn't dragged down in a coming trade war.
It's quite possible that he will get it. I mean, this is the smart policy. I mean, the EU is the bigger trading partner. The question obviously arises that if Trump gets tough on the EU and imposes tariffs, but he doesn't impose tariffs on the EU on the UK, that affects the UK-EU trading relationship, whether you want it or not, because it basically means that the UK will be in an advantaged position, and there may well be European companies, EU companies, that move to the UK in order to do trade with with the United States. It might just be a very attractive. Now BMW, having the mini plant in Oxford. No, obviously, I don't think they sell minis to the United States. It's not the kind of car Americans drive. But they might just expand their UK operations to sell some of the stuff from here if there is free trade.
We could get Volkswagen and Audi having assembly plants in the UK in order to have a tariff-free relationship.
Well, I think that would be then a case where the EU would probably annex the UK into the single market. Oh, I'm joking, but it's certainly a situation where something would not work from the EU's perspective. So if they have a trade war with Trump and the UK is on Trump's side, then the reality of a close relationship with the EU sounds rhetorically quite fine. And there are Europeans who want this.
So at the very least, it strengthens Keir Starmer's negotiating hand that he appears to be in a better position than the European Union with Trump.
He certainly is better position with Trump because the UK doesn't have as many issues. He doesn't have as many issues with the UK. He doesn't. I mean, it's the UK is not really a problem for him, and he can divide the Europeans with this. This will help. This is what he wants.
There is potentially a unique role for the UK, in which case the Brexit will suddenly feel like a better idea, in that it can play a kind of halfway house between the US and Europe, which is sort of how it's always thought of itself.
I doubt that it will kind of pan out like this. I think what will happen is that the so-called reset with the EU will be mostly rhetorical. I think the UK has a problem which is very similar to Germany's problem, which is it's run out of a business model that used to work quite well until the global financial crisis. The UK has not generated productivity growth since, and it needs to do some deep thinking. And there are not many people, certainly not in the current government, who actually think about what needs to happen in order for this business model to work. I think that the tariffs are peripheral to this bigger problem that the UK faces. The UK is not alone about this. I mean, your continental economies also have this problem. The German model doesn't work either anymore. Trade has something to do with it. It's more the end of globalization, the stuff we talked at the beginning, the shifts that have taken place in the global environment that are causing this to happen. So the UK will need to do some deep thinking. But I have a hope that the UK eventually will find a new model. I am much more pessimistic about the EU and Germany in particular to find a new model. So the EU is much more likely to decline relative, and the UK may at one point, as it did in the past, it had it did manage to rejuvenate itself.
Okay, let me ask you a final question that is the biggest one. You've said you're a free trader and you're overall don't think this tariff war is a good idea. You said there aren't really going to be any winners for it. Who do you think relatively is most likely to be the winner, or at least the least damaged party?
That question is easy to answer, and that's the United States. There will be some costs, but the United States has a lower share of trade in its GDP. It's much less dependent on trade for its wealth and for its income than we are, and than China is, and then others are. So it is a large domestic economy. And it can do this. It has big consequences on the rest of the world. It might affect US security, because Europeans this is what I may also see, the Europeans may no longer be as transatlantic in nature as they do, and the UK may be more transatlantic than they do, so there may be sort of another divide happening in Europe. It may break up the EU, all sorts of things might happen. Or it might divide the EU, not break it up, but divide it and make it less effectual. But the United States will be able, especially with its technology leadership, the US will significantly, it will continue to do well in this regime. I would not bet on the Trump trade policy wrecking the American economy. I think it's wishful thinking.
Wolfgang, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Wolfgang Münchau, UnHerd columnist and economist, an expert on matters of trade, tariffs, and of course the European Union, giving us a bit of a tour de force, a global tour of what these new tariff wars might turn out to be, and who might be the winners and who might be the losers. I learned a lot. Hope you did too. This was UnHerd.